Hello chess friends! Today we are looking at another stunning performance by Magnus Carlsen from the Mr. Dodgy Invitational, an online blitz tournament, in which Carlsen once again demonstrates his machine-like ability to find the most devastating and efficient moves with which to punish his opponent, in this case the strong Grandmaster Shevchenko, despite the extreme limitation of time on the clock, that is only 5 minutes each with no increment. And I just have to say, it's quite humbling to see someone play a better game with only 5 minutes on their clock than I could play in 5 hours. But enough said, let's get right into the game because I know that's what you came here to see. Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces begins the game with d4, d5 from Shevchenko, c4, and we get some standard Slav moves with c6, knight to f3, knight to f6, knight to c3, and d takes c4. Carlsen plays the best move. He plays a4. To prevent the pawn from being defended with b5. For example, if you were to just play the natural looking e4, targeting the pawn with the bishop, black can get away with b5 here. And if you try to undermine the pawn structure with a4, there's always just b4 once that knight moves. This pawn is under fire. Not a good variation for white. So a4, Shevchenko plays bishop to f5. It's a good move. Getting his bishop outside the pawn chain after e6 is played. He doesn't want the bishop back here. He's also watching over the e4 square, so that white is going to have to play e3 instead of the superior move e4. That square is hit by 2 pieces. If instead he were to try to hang on to the c4 pawn with a6, then white gets his nice pawn center with e4. And unless you're a beginner, you probably know that black can't get away with trying to defend the c4 pawn with b5 because there's always this idea of a takes b5, c takes b5, and at some point knight takes b5 is going to be possible because if you recapture, you're losing the rook. The engine says play e5 first and then maybe knight takes b5 on the next move. So it's a common theme in these queen pawn openings where the pawn is captured on c4. Black can't get away with defending that pawn in a lot of lines. After bishop f5, Carlsen plays e3, and now we got e6, opening a diagonal for the bishop. Here Carlsen plays a5. His plan is queen to a4, which will be a multi-purpose move. He's anticipating that bishop b4 will be a good move for black, so that's going to hit that square, either preventing bishop b4 or attacking the bishop once it gets there. It also will place the queen on the same diagonal as the king, and will potentially pin this pawn so that c5 cannot be played right away. That's a useful move for black, striking at the white center. So there's a lot of logic to this queen a4 idea. Shevchenko plays knight b to d7. First, Carlsen takes out the pawn on c4, and after bishop b4, we got queen a4 with an attack on the bishop. Shevchenko defends with queen to e7. Another option would have been c5, but here d takes c5, bishop takes c5, and now we see another point to the queen on a4. It supports the move b4, expanding on the queen side with tempo, attacking the bishop. Maybe that's why Shevchenko didn't go for that variation. Instead, he just simply defends his bishop. Both sides castle. Now that black has castled, there's a threat. Let's suppose white were to play rook d1. See if you can see what black is threatening. What would you play here as black? Here black has b5 with the fork. So unless white wants to lose a piece, he's got to play a takes b6 en passant. And now we got knight takes b6 with a fork again. Now if black hadn't castled, there would be queen takes c6 with check, since the king would still be right there, and this would be very good for white. Of course, if you play it here, now that black's castled, there's just rook f to c8, and this bishop is going to be lost once the queen moves because the knight and the rook are hitting it, so you can't go there. You would have to play to b3 and defend the bishop. Then black can take, queen takes, and white's not losing here, but there's no reason to give up the bishop pair like that. So Carlsen addresses that threat by simply moving the bishop back to e2. So black does not play b5. He plays rook a to c8, supporting a possible c5 advance. Rook d1 by Carlsen. Shevchenko plays rook f to d8. This prepares the move c5 in a subtle way, because if you were to try c5 right away without that rook move, this is not good because of the move e4. Expanding in the center, black would love to just take out that pawn and win a pawn. You know, the bishop and the knight are hitting it, but that would lose to knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, d takes c5. With a discovered attack on the knight with the queen and rook, also the bishop's under attack. No good way to save both, black is losing. So that's why Shevchenko puts his rook on d8, adding some extra protection to that knight, so that c5 is much more playable. Carlsen plays bishop to d2, c5. So here Carlsen plays bishop to e1, just adding some central control with the rook. C takes d4 by Shevchenko, knight takes d4, hitting the bishop. And there's also a more subtle threat, which apparently Shevchenko does not spot. What he should play here is a6. You will see why in a minute, but instead he decides to back up with that bishop. But Carlsen immediately takes advantage of this potentially weak square c6 with the move a6, attacking this pawn. And if b takes a6 is played, there's a fork. Knight's defended by the queen. Shevchenko realizes that, so he plays knight to b6, defending b7 with the queen, and attacking the white queen. So Carlsen moves the queen to b5. It's a good move, but even better and more decisive would have been queen to b3. The threat now is to take on b7, and if the queen recaptures, you're losing your bishop, since the queen was defending the bishop. So maybe the best move is to just take on a6, but in this line you can play bishop takes a6. Unlike what was played in the game with the queen on b5. So this move comes with an attack on the rook on c8, and that rook has to stay on this file to guard against knight c6. The threat of the fork is still alive, but if you play rook c7, white can play knight c6 anyway. Because if the rook takes the knight, there's queen takes b4. Now black does not have to take the queen on b4. You could move to c7 or something, and white's going to have a winning position according to the engine. But I should show you queen takes b4 since that's the most critical line. This takes protection off the rook on d8. So after rook takes d8, you're going to have to put your queen in the way. It's the only way to avoid checkmate. And after rook takes f8 check, king takes, bishop b5, hits the rook, opens up the attack on the pawn, rook c7 defends. But here the engine says white just has a totally winning position with this move f3, threatening to come in with this other bishop. And it's saying black should play the knight to d5, bishop g3, and at the end of the day, this a-pawn's going to fall. The rook just can't defend it. There's no safe square. You go to b7, there's bishop c6. If you try rook e7, there's going to be bishop d6, pinning the rook and winning more material. So black is just totally busted in this line. But it is not surprising in a blitz game that Carlsen did not see all of that. It's far from obvious that you can sack a knight here and then immediately after sack the queen. It's quite an amazing variation. It's the kind of thing that could easily go unnoticed without the use of an engine. Queen b5, white has a big advantage in this line, though maybe not totally decisive yet. Shevchenko takes on a6. We got queen takes a6. So in this line, since you didn't capture with the bishop, this rook's not in danger, but the a-pawn is hit. Any way you try to defend that pawn with a rook is going to be problematic because these knights are so active here. If you try rook c7, the knight goes to b5. And if you try to move the rook, I mean, you can't neglect the c6 square. There's knight c6. That threat's still alive. If you try something like rook d7, there's knight a4, threatening to take out the knight, which is the only defender of this rook. At the end of the day, white's pieces are just too active over here on the queen side, and these knights are just wreaking havoc. Let me just show you one line. If this is played here, adding defense to that rook, you got bishop takes b4, queen takes b4, and then knight b5 with an attack on this rook. Once that rook moves, you got knight takes a7, hitting the other rook, also removing the defense of this knight, which is now hit by two pieces. Black's totally busted here. So it's just an example of what happens if you just try to defend with the rook. So Shevchenko makes a good practical decision, and he takes on c3 and goes for some counterplay. After bishop takes c3, he says, I'm going to just attack the c3 square with knight to e4. But this move 19 turns out to be a fatal error. Better here would have been knight f to d5. It accomplishes the same thing. It attacks c3, but it also keeps some extra defense of the knight on b6. So I'm going to show you the critical line. After knight to e4, Carlsen plays bishop to e1, just getting out of the way. Now here, if the knight was on d5, a decent defense for black would be rook d7. But let me show you why it's bad with the knight on e4. This is what the computer's saying anyway. Bishop to b5 hits the rook. Okay, rook goes to c7. Now we got knight c6, which of course lets black get two minor pieces for a rook. Like so. White takes here on a7. The beautiful thing about this is you can't take the queen or there's rook d8 with checkmate. So you have to move the queen, and now rook a6 is very nasty. Double attack on that knight, If it moves, you got rook takes rook. Of course, if the queen leaves the back rank, you still have the problem of rook d8. If in this position the knight was on d5, black would be okay. That knight would have enough protection, and then rook c7 could be played, attacking the queen. So that seems to be the key line demonstrating why it's better to have the knight on d5. All else being equal, it's best to position your pieces where they are defended by other pieces whenever possible. So in this position, after Carlsen retreats the bishop to e1, we have knight c5 with an attack on the queen. Now Carlsen makes an interesting decision. He doesn't take the pawn. That would be winning. Queen takes a7, queen takes, rook takes. I don't know why he didn't go for this. Maybe he didn't like the knight going here, hitting this pawn, and then if the pawn's pushed, it allows the knight to drop into c3. Maybe Carlsen thought that was too much activity for black, even though the engine says white is winning. Instead, he goes for queen to a3, pinning the knight to the queen. And here Shevchenko decides to get out of the pin right away with queen to b7. Looks kind of logical. Unfortunately, that is not a safe square for the queen. The computer says that you don't even have to address the pin. You can just play this move h6, prophylactically giving your king a possible escape square so the back rank isn't so vulnerable. And white apparently can't just pile up on that knight and win it, since black can defend it adequately, but nevertheless will still have a winning position with the move b4, kicking the knight, and then pushing to b5, locking down that weak pawn. And at the end of the day, white is going to win this pawn. But Shevchenko plays queen to b7. This makes Carlsen's life easier since it gives him the potential of a bishop to a6 threat, if this knight could be made to move. So he immediately targets that knight with bishop to b4. Now that knight's attacked with two pieces. Of course, if it's moved, there's simply bishop to a6. Once the queen moves, you're capturing the rook. So instead, Shevchenko defends the knight. That way, if the bishop captures, it'll just be replaced by another knight. a6 is covered. But now Carlsen plays knight to b5, threatening this fork. And there's also another threat involving bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, rook takes, removing the defense from this knight. Rook takes, queen takes c5. So a couple different threats going on. Shevchenko does not have a great way to address them both. He tries knight e4, which looks like it might work. It gets the knight out of danger and it adds protection to d6, but Carlsen just attacks that knight. f3. If you move the knight, there's a fork. So Shevchenko attempts a counterattack with a6. He doesn't really have anything else. Carlsen simply takes on a6, and we have queen takes a6, rook takes a6. This knight is still under attack. If you simply move the knight, let's say you play knight ef6, here there's bishop e7, taking advantage of this rook's shortage of squares. It can only go to e8, and then there's knight d6 with a fork. You know, rook takes e7, knight takes c8. White's winning the exchange. So Shevchenko makes a last-ditch attempt with knight d to c5, counterattack on the rook, but Carlsen simply takes the rook on d8. After rook takes d8, rook to c6, and white is attacking two of black's pieces, the knight on e4 and the knight on c5 with two pieces. Black cannot defend both, and so Shevchenko resigns. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that masterful performance by Magnus Carlsen, playing a nearly perfect game with only a few moves that could even be significantly improved upon. Quite a feat against the strong grandmaster in a blitz game. Please subscribe to the channel for more top quality analysis coming your way soon.